I'd like to just tell you about Scott Barron, and he is a United States Army veteran of the Vietnam War, and he a graduate of California State University, Northridge. He worked in law enforcement for a decade and taught at the Police Academy and a community college in Aptos, California. He's an author of They Also Served, Military Biographies of Uncommon Americans, and has co-authored International Stars at War, Soldiers Lost at Sea, Women at War, and Navy Cross with James E. Wise, Jr. He writes a monthly column with the GI Jobs magazine and has published articles in several magazines, including Stars and Stripes. And he lives in Watsonville, California. Isn't that where the artichokes are? Castroville and all of that? Yes. And he teaches U.S. history in Salinas, California. And when I go to James Wise, I just want to comment that Buck Newsom came to us and spoke with Bill Lacey, who's our director, and I think you all know that Bill Lacey is working on Fred Thompson's campaign. And he said, this is a person you really need to bring in. And we followed up on his advice, and we were all so pleased when James Wise could come and visit us this evening. And Captain Wise became a naval aviator in 1953 following his graduation from Northwestern University. And during his early Navy career, he served in various squadrons and on staffs and was a Navy ROTC instructor at KU in the early 1960s. So he has roots on our campus. He was aboard the aircraft carrier USS America in 1967 during the Six-Day War in the Eastern Mediterranean, and later served on the America in the Gulf of Tonkin during the Vietnam War. He commanded various naval intelligence units, and since he retired in 1975, and he's held senior executive positions, posts in the private sector companies. He has written and co-authored over a dozen books, last 4 with Scott Barron, and his articles have appeared in Mirror periodicals and journals. He worked with actor James Arness, and we all know about Gunsmoke, and Marshal Matt Dillon, on his published biography, and has appeared on A&E Biography, Fox News Live, PBS, and has appeared with also Olive North's War Stories, several military documentaries, and has been a guest on numerous radio talk shows, and he presently resides in Alexandria, Virginia. I can tell you from the conversation we had over dinner that they have delightful stories to tell you, and we asked him why was he inspired to write this book, and I'm sure you will hear comments about that. But it's not often that you have an opportunity for someone who's inspired to write something because they really believe in it. They have served, and they know all about it. So we will have our question and answer period after they finish, and we all know what the drill is. We'll just ask you when you come in not to come down this line because it's in the line of our taping for this evening. But again, we're so pleased that you're here, and we're going to open with Captain Wise. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Basically, we're going to tell you a lot of very interesting stories about our kids over in the Middle East and some of the very heroic things that they do almost on a day-to-day basis. We'll be covering, first of all, the women and what they do. And I think you'll be rather amazed to see what their occupations are now. And then we'll do the Navy Cross. Scott will do Iraq, I'll do Afghanistan, and I'll pretty much cover the Luttrell book, The Lone Survivor, the SEAL that made it out of Afghanistan. His story, in addition to the battle that they had with the Taliban, is a very remarkable story, and very few people have heard about it. Right now we're working on the Silver Star, which will complement the Navy Cross book. And then we've been contracted to do the Jessica Clements story. She's was an Army National Guard soldier who was on her way to the airport, or the truck was, and it was hit by an IED. She collapsed. She woke up in Walter Reed. She was given a 2% chance to live, and she made it. She's been on Oprah and on 60 Minutes, and finally, through our correspondence with her, she's asked us to do her book, and I think you'll find it rather amazing. So let's go ahead and start. Let me just mention why we decided to do these books, and I've done mostly historical books on German U-boats. I wrote one with a German U-boat commander, and my son went to Iraq, Special Forces, Army Ranger, and of course that was a worrisome year. And when he came back, he told me some of the things that they were doing. And you never heard about these things in the mainstream media. I mean, these kids they're in the war zone. And when people say that, women in combat doesn't work, it's irrelevant because they're in the war zone now. There's no rear and no front line. And any time they step out of a tent, a mortar can go off and they'll get killed. I talked to one NCIS gal. She was in the green zone having lunch, and a mortar dropped right beside her, and she went 15 feet in the air. She wasn't killed, but she recovered. So the inspiration is to bring to light and put into legacy what these kids have done. We should never forget these people. They're probably our best generation of young people today. So let's go ahead and begin. Oh, that's over there, yeah. Okay. World War I, basically, we had nurses and yeomanettes, and that's about all they could do. It was interesting, last week I got a call from the historian at Walter Reed Hospital, and they found that, going through their records, that one of the Army nurses merited a Silver Star. So last week at the Women's Memorial in Washington, the descendants of her family came in, and she was honored with a Silver Star medal. And also, 4 nurses won the Navy Cross during the 1918 pandemic. And whether you know it or not, 30 million people died in that pandemic, the Spanish flu. In World War II, this is in Corregidor, one of the nurses, and pretty much the women were relegated to nursing. However, we had the first flight nurses come along, and they were flying wounded out of the various Pacific islands. We had the WASP, the Women's and Air Force Service, and they flew everything. They flew every kind of aircraft that our boys were flying in combat, from B-17s, B-24s, A-26s, and they were very good. This woman is an interesting story, Betty LeSueur, and I met her at a documentary we were doing out in California. And she's 91, she's a pilot, and she's still flying. She was born in Canada. Her father was shifted to Maryland, and she went to the University of Maryland, and there was an airfield right next door, so she went and learned how to fly. But she felt that we weren't doing enough for the British. Of course, we weren't in the war at the time. Well, she couldn't get an American passport because she had to be 21. So she took her Canadian passport and went to Canada, took a merchant ship across the Atlantic, ended up in London at the RAF headquarters, and said, "I'm here to fly." Well, they put her in the Auxiliary Transport Corps, which is the same as their WASP. And when we landed at D-Day, they wouldn't let the women go over there, just the men in that transport unit. So she quit. She went with the OSS. She ended up heading the largest spy unit in southern France. Married another OSS agent, and he was from a very prominent Spanish family. Lived on Mallorca, And she keeps writing me every year to come to Mallorca and spend some time with her family. And her very best friend for many, many years, and the godmother of one of her sons, was the actress Ava Gardner. And this was during Vietnam, passing out Purple Hearts to nurses during an attack on Saigon. Now, some of the women in the war in other countries were doing a lot of fighting. And this gal, Lydia Lentiak, is the leading or the all-time fighter ace in the world, female. She shot down 7 German aircraft outside of Stalingrad. She was shot down in 1969. They found the wreckage of her aircraft, and they built a museum, and she's so honored. She was called the White Lily, and they painted, she fought Yak fighter aircraft, and they painted a lily on her fuselage, and every time she shot down an airplane, they put a blue star around it. These were called the Night Witches. These were Soviet bomber pilots flying biplanes. And this is the sniper of all time, Lashenko. She killed 309 German soldiers. She was brought to America. The FDR took her into the White House, honored her. She made a tour, and she went to Winchester, and they gave her a special rifle, and she's never been excelled. Now, I've read that the Air Force trains women snipers, and that they're positioned around the green zone. And that's been corroborated by a couple of pieces that I've read. Women basically have more patience to lay motionless, and they have, and I shouldn't say this, but they have more body fat, which protects them against the cold. This gal, Major Marie Rossi Clayton, was the first woman aviator to get to lose her life. It was during Desert Storm, and she was flying an unarmed helicopter and was transporting Iraqi POWs back and forth, and she hit a light tower in Saudi Arabia, and the aircraft crashed and everybody died, but she was the first woman aviator to die. Now today, you've got complete female flight crews. This is a C-130 cockpit, and women are flying these on a daily basis. And these are their cargo people in the back of the aircraft. They not only fly transports, but they fly refueling aircraft. This is Kim Campbell. She's looking at damage from any aircraft on a Warthog, which is a twin-jet close support aircraft. And they used to call her Killer Chick. These are 2 Navy pilots just coming back aboard the carrier after flying close air support. This is Jaden Kim. Jaden Kim is a South Korean. She's a Marine Special Weapons Officer. She flew in the backseat of a Hornet, and she's a very remarkable person. Right now, she's out of the service, out of the Marine Corps, and she's flying a feeder airline out of Reagan National Airport. And this is Colonel McSally. Colonel McSally is flying a Warthog, and she was the first Air Force commanding officer of a fighter squadron. And this is Tammy Duckworth. Most of you have heard of Tammy Duckworth. She was flying a Black Hawk helicopter, one of our larger combatants, and she was coming in for a landing and got hit by a rocket-propelled grenade. And it hit her right below her seat. And although she was trying to land the aircraft and turn the knobs and things of that nature, the co-pilot took over and landed the aircraft, and she lost her legs, and he thought she was dead. Excuse me, let me get the scratch out of my... So they evacuated everybody else in the aircraft, put them in another medevac plane, and they plopped her down next to this wounded guy. And his hand was in her blood, and her blood was warm. So he said to the medic, he said, "I think she's alive." And so they took her in. She lost both legs, part of an arm, but she made it. And when I met her, and I interviewed her, it was at Constitution Hall in Washington, and she was being given a award of the year. And she walked up to the platform on titanium legs, about that thick, and gave the greatest speech you could ever possibly hear. Just inspirational. As you might know, she ran for Congress out of Naperville, Illinois. Didn't make the seat, but she is now director of the Veterans Administration in the state of Illinois. And this gal, this is the first gal that got into the 82nd Airborne, and her name is Leanne Mary. I've got her mixed here somewhere. But anyway, she saw action in Iraq, and she makes jumps with the 82nd Airborne, and more women are going into that group. This is Leanne Hester. Hester here is shown receiving the Silver Star. She's the first woman to be awarded a Silver Star since World War II. And the nurses at Anzio were awarded Silver Stars for their action. She's from Kentucky, by the way. She was a women's shoe salesperson until she got called up, and she was in a Humvee protecting a convoy, and the convoy got stopped up front. So she raced up with two other Humvees, and people from Kentucky are pretty tough. She got out of there, and they took out all the insurgents. And when they finished with that, they went down into a valley, and there were the insurgents' trucks, and they all had plastic things for handcuffs. They were going to try and make hostages out of all of them. But I think she said she killed 12 or 13 of them. This is Mary Kruger. She's a family doctor, and she went to Kabul in Afghanistan. And it's kind of interesting, when she set up her tent to look at some of the Afghanistan families, 2,000 Afghanistan women and children surrounded her tent, and the Afghan soldiers had to keep them from tearing the tent apart because they knew that this was going to be the only doctor that they would probably ever see, and their family and their children would ever see. And right now, the percentage for children that reach, well, 20% of the children never reach the age of 15. And she asked one woman, how old she was. And the woman said, "Well, I'm a Kuchi woman," which means wanderer. And she says, I'm born, I live like a cow, and I die. So what difference is it how old I am? And it was really very, very sad, the conversation she's had with the Afghanistan women. And this is Jessica Clemens. This is the gal who we're going to write our next book on. She, believe it or not, she was driving fuel trucks. And this shows her filling one of the trucks. And this was after her accident when she received the Purple Heart. And she's remarkable, and she's going to the University of Akron now. She's got pretty much full disability. And, when you come out of it with 2/3 of your head, or 1/3 of your head gone, and to survive the way she did, and we followed her from the time she was wearing a football helmet to getting her balance on roller skates and this type of thing, and to come out of this thing is just absolutely miraculous. So we'll be doing her story. Okay, I'm going to turn this over now to Scott. Scott's going to talk about the Navy Cross. Scott?
When Jim invited me to speak tonight, join him to speak tonight, he said, I said, what are we going to be talking about? He said, we're going to be talking about valor. I thought, oh, that's a bad thing. Because in 2 years as a military policeman, the closest I ever came to combat was battling drunks in Panamanian cantinas. So I figured I'd better do a little research before I come down here and start talking about something I know very little about. So the first place I started was the dictionary. I decided to look up, what is valor? What is courage? What is a hero? Well, the dictionary defines courage as the ability to confront fear, pain, danger, uncertainty, or intimidation. Mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand danger, fear, and difficulty. Greatness of heart in facing danger. Bold and daring defiance of danger. Synonyms include bravery, valor, heroism. So I looked up the word hero. Hero is defined as someone who in the face of danger and adversity, or from a position of weakness, displays courage or the will of self-sacrifice for the greater good. It's also a mythological or legendary figure, an illustrious warrior, one who shows great courage and daring, and it's also a sandwich. So then I figured maybe we should look up, see what some of the great minds of history have said about valor. Aristotle said that courage was the greatest quality of the mind, next to honor. Hemingway defined it as grace under pressure. And Mark Twain said that courage isn't being fearless, it's acting in spite of that fear. So I said, okay, well, let's see what the generals have to say. Andrew Jackson said that one man with courage is a majority. Patton said that courage is holding on for 1 minute longer. Von Clausewitz said that courage above all things is the quality of a warrior. And General Schwarzkopf said it doesn't take a hero to order men into battle. It takes a hero to be one of those men who goes into battle. So I figured, okay, let's check and see what the men who have been in battle have to say about this. Senator Daniel Inouye, who won the Distinguished Service Cross in World War II, said, there's no such thing as a one-person hero. Sergeant Major Bradley Cassell, who we'll be talking about later, said, my men are my heroes. Not everyone is universal in their definition of heroism, I found out. Justin Lee Hugh, who won the Navy Cross, said, there are heroes in the world, but we aren't it. We were just doing our job. And Pappy Boynton, who also won the Navy Cross, said, just name me a hero and I'll show you a bum. So I thought tonight we would explore valor through the Navy Cross and some of the men who have won the Navy Cross. Prior to 1919, there was no award for valor except for the Medal of Honor. In 1919, following World War II, we realized that we needed some way to recognize valor, especially for our allies who had millions of medals. So, in 1919, Congress authorized the creation of the Distinguished Service Cross for the Army. And shortly thereafter, the Navy followed through with the creation of the Navy Cross. Oops. All right. Obviously, this is also grace under pressure. And the criteria for awarding the Navy Cross. The Navy Cross may be awarded to any person who, while serving with the Navy or Marine Corps in time of war, or the Coast Guard, distinguishes himself in action by extraordinary heroism, not justifying the award of a Medal of Honor. The action must take place under one of three circumstances. 1, while engaged in action against an enemy of the United States. 2, while engaged in military operations involving conflict with an opposing foreign force. Or 3, while serving with friendly foreign forces engaged in an armed conflict in which the United States is not a belligerent party. To earn a Navy Cross, the act to be commended must be performed in the presence of great danger or at great personal risk, and must be performed in such a manner as to render the individual highly conspicuous among others of equal grade, rate, experience, or position of responsibility. An accumulation of minor acts of heroism does not justify the award of a Navy Cross. It was originally authorized to include distinguished acts of a non-combat nature, and it was third in precedence following the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. In 1942, in the middle of World War II, they changed it and they moved it up in precedence to the second highest award, and today the Navy Cross can only be awarded for acts that occur in combat. The medal itself, a modified cross pate, was designed by James Earl Fraser, who you might not be aware of the name itself, but if you've ever seen the statue of the End of the Trail, or those of you who are old enough to remember the Buffalo Head nickel, those were also designed by Mr. Fraser. It's suspended from a blue ribbon with a white center stripe. The blue represents the naval service, and the white represents purity of service. I'm just having the most difficult time with this. There we are. Well, no conversation regarding the Navy Cross would be complete without talking about Lieutenant Lewis B. Puller, who many of you recognize as Chested Puller, who won 5 Navy Crosses, unprecedented. He's the only Marine to ever win 5 Navy Crosses. Only one other man, a commander of a submarine, won 5 Navy Crosses. He rose from private to lieutenant general. He fought in 2 world wars. He fought in Korea. He fought in Haiti, Nicaragua, China. And he became as famous for what he said as for what he did. He was related to George Patton. They were both grew up in the South. They both had Confederate grandfathers. And he grew up listening to tales of the Civil War. Probably he's most famous for saying that one time when he was surrounded by the enemy, he called his officers together. He said, "All right, men, the enemy is to our left, the enemy is to our right, the enemy is to our front, and the enemy is to our rear. They can't get away now." He left VMI to enlist as a private during World War I, a private in the Marine Corps. He wanted to go to combat, but before he could graduate officers training, they ended the war and they decommissioned him. Undeterred, he re-enlisted in the Marines as a private. He went to Haiti, where Marine enlisted men could serve as officers in the Gendarmes de Haiti, fighting the Caco rebels. In 1923, he returned to the United States. He re-enlisted yet again, and this time attended officers training and was commissioned as second lieutenant in the regular Marine Corps. In 1927, he returned to Latin America, this time to Nicaragua, fighting the Sandinista rebels. At that time, they weren't known as the Sandinistas, but they were led by a man named Augusto Cesar Sandino, which is where the name Sandinistas come from. There had been a U.S. presence in Nicaragua from 1909 to 1933. And in 1930, he led a force of 35 enlisted men in 5 successive engagements against superior rebel forces, and he was awarded his first Navy Cross. In 1931, he returned back to America. He went to the company's officers' course at Fort Benning. At that time, the commander was a man by the name of Lieutenant Colonel George Marshall, and his classmates included such men as Walter Bedell Smith, Omar Bradley, Joseph Stilwell, and Oliver P. Smith. He returned to Nicaragua with the reputation as the Lion of Segovia, and he was tasked with capturing Sandino. And this was where he won his second Naval Cross. Following the presidential election of 1932, President Hoover promised that we would withdraw from Nicaragua by January 1st, 1933. Basically, let the Nicaraguans take care of their own defenses. Sounds familiar. Unfortunately, it was a bad decision because the government was weak, and a man by the name of Anastasio Somoza led a coup, took over the government, and that initiated 4 decades of dictatorship in Nicaragua. With two Navy Crosses and experience in fighting in the jungle, he was ready for World War II. And after some time in China and aboard the USS Augusta, which at that time was commanded by Captain Chester Nimitz, he was back in China, where he had some run-ins with the Japanese. They had a difference of opinion. But in August of 41, he was ordered home to take command of the 1st of the 7th Marines at New River. Believing that a war was coming, he trained his men hard, but he always had a reputation for fairness. One time, there's a story, he came upon a Marine private standing in front of a lieutenant, and the Marine private was just standing there saluting. So he went up to the lieutenant and he asked him what was going on. And the lieutenant said that this private had forgotten to salute this officer, and so this officer had ordered the private to salute him 100 times. Well, he looked at that lieutenant, he said, "You are right, Lieutenant, you are so right. But remember that under military custom, an officer must return every salute that is rendered to him." And Chesty stood by while that lieutenant returned those 100 salutes. Well, the 1st Marine Division gets its orders after Pearl Harbor to go to Guadalcanal, and Chesty is excited about this. He feels that he will be the first into combat. Unfortunately for him, he ended up going to Guam, and the rest of the division went to Guadalcanal. But not to be put off, he arrived there about a month afterwards, just in time for the Battle of Henderson Field, which was September 18th. And during this point, during his time there was an assault at a place called Matanacao River. And the Marines went in, but unfortunately they weren't able to get out. The commander was willing to sacrifice those men, but Chester Puller said there was no way he was going to leave these Marines behind. He signaled down a destroyer, the USS Monson. And with the Monson, they sailed over to that area with some Higgins boats. And because he'd been aboard the Augusta as a gunnery officer, he knew how to operate 5-inch guns. As a result, he laid down a covering fire, and the Marines were safely evacuated from envelopment. In fact, it was during this action that a Coast Guard signalman by the name of Douglas Monroe won the Medal of Honor for that action, the only Coast Guardsman to ever been awarded the Medal of Honor, and there were 6 Navy Crosses awarded for the same action. Well, they were defending Henderson Field in October, and he defended Henderson Field against 6 bonsai charges. At one point, an officer came up to me and said, "Colonel, we're low on information." Chester looked at me and said, "Well, you've got bayonets, haven't you?" And basically, he went on to win his 3rd Navy Cross at Guadalcanal, largely being credited for the response for the successful defense. At Peleliu, a little later on, with casualties at 50%, the Marines were greatly outnumbered by the Japanese. There were 17,000 specialist troops. Colonel Puller called up the higher command. He said, "I need more men. Send me those 17,000 specialist troops." The officer said, "They're not trained infantry." Chesty replied, "You give them to me, and by tomorrow afternoon, they'll be trained infantry." They defended, they attacked, and they took 54% casualty. For Chesty, it was his last battle in World War II. They returned him to America. He was wounded, and he spent the rest of the war training people. Because of some of the things he said, he was rather out of favor, and he was looking towards retirement when he was saved by Korea. He was involved with the amphibious landing at Incheon. It was the first time since Chapultepec in 1847 that the Marines had used scaling ladders, which they used to overcome the seawalls at Incheon. He was also involved in hand-to-hand fighting in Seoul, and he was with the Marines when they moved up, landed at Wonsan. They moved up to the Yalu River. They got as far north as Yadam-ni, which was on the west side of the Chosan Reservoir, when 260 Chinese troops decided to join the party, and the 5th and 7th Marines were enveloped by the Chinese. At this point, he called his officers together. He said, "We've been looking for the enemy for 6 days now. We found them. We're surrounded," which makes our task of finding them and killing them significantly easier. He also won some favor from the Air Force because a reporter flew in to Kodori and asked General Puller, or Colonel Puller at this point, how he felt about being surrounded by the Chinese. And he replied that it was a damn sight better than the U.S. Army because he knew that in the morning at least the Chinese would be there. This did not make him friends with the Army. They began their fighting withdrawal from the Chosan River, and when a reporter asked General Smith why they were retreating, he made his famous remark, "Retreat hell, we're just advancing in a different direction." During this time, you have to imagine they were short on just about everything. They had no cold weather gear. They had very little ammunition, and they were fighting sub-zero temperatures. They offered him the option of leaving his equipment and his dead behind. He said there was no way he was going to do that, and he didn't. They fought a fighting withdrawal all the way down to Hungham, taking all of their equipment, all of their wounded, and all of their dead with them. He was forced into retirement because of high blood pressure, and his last official statement on the day he retired was, "I hate like hell to go." Admiral Arleigh Burke said men fought with Chesty Puller and fought magnificently because he knew how to fight. But he also knew how to lead from the front, at the front. He said that he kept his command post in his pocket. Let's hope this works. Yay. There's another picture of Chesty. Now this is Pappy Boynton. Many of you are probably familiar with Pappy Boynton, and I'm not going to speak very much about Pappy Boynton, but I wanted you to see this photograph because this photograph is historical. This is Pappy Boynton accepting the Medal of Honor from President Truman. What makes this picture so significant, of course, is this is his second award of the Medal of Honor. The first one was awarded posthumously. He had been shot down over Rabaul and captured by the Japanese. But he was very clever. He didn't tell the Japanese he was a fighter pilot. He told them he was a staff officer, and they left him pretty much alone. Well, back in the United States, they decided to award him the Medal of Honor, and it made all the papers. And as you can imagine, the Japanese saw those papers, and they treated him viciously for the next 20 months. And Pappy Boynton said that winning the Medal of Honor was probably the worst thing that ever happened to him in his life. He also won the Navy Cross during World War II, also awarded posthumously. But he is the only man in history to be awarded the Medal of Honor twice for the same event. This gentleman here is John Basilone, also known as Fighting John or Manila John. Now, many of us have seen movies, and his life sounds like a movie. Boy of modest means, goes to combat, wins the Medal of Honor, comes home to fame, parades, dates with starlets, rallies. They offer him a commission. They offer him any job in the Marines that he would like. But all he wants to do is return to his boys. He finds love. He marries a Marine sergeant, female, and basically creates such havoc trying to get back to war that he leaves the higher command with two choices. Either court-martial national hero or give him what he wants. So they gave him what he wants. They sent him back to war, which is exactly what he wanted. He wanted to be with his boys. He ends up raising over $1.4 million on a war bond tour. And when they offer him a commission, he says, I ain't no officer and I ain't no damn museum piece. Send me back to war. He actually appeals to his old commander, General Vandergrift. He says, how can you take Manila without Manila John? Well, they relent and they send him back to the Marines. And he arrives at Iwo Jima on the day of the landing. He is the first wave ashore. His platoon is among the first troops. And by all accounts, he's walking upright along the beach under heavy fire, kicking the men, saying, get up, get off the beach. He says there's only going to be two types of people on this beach, dead men and the men that are soon to be dead. He gets them off the beach, but they find their path blocked by a fortified blockhouse, which he single-handedly removes. On his way back to the beach, he's killed by a mortar round, and he's awarded a posthumous Navy Cross. This gentleman here is Sergeant Anthony Vigiani. He must have been inspired by Barcelona because 60 years later he says pretty much the same thing. He wants to be with his boys. It's June of 2004. He's assigned to the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines at a place called Kabargo, which is a village in Afghanistan. He'd been a Marine security guard. He'd worked at Camp David, but he wanted to go to combat and kept volunteering. Finally, he arrived in Afghanistan. At one point, they were clearing a village, and he's notified that some insurgents are escaping to the north. So with 12 men, he gives chase. Now, you have to picture Afghanistan. You have to picture these tall valleys. He describes the terrain as rocky, rough, beautiful, but unforgiving. And they pursue these Afghanistan guerrillas into the hills, but the guerrillas had left a delaying force. And as they're going up this narrow ravine with the enemy on both sides in fortified positions, he finds his Marines pinned down. And so under fire, both friendly and enemy, because you have to picture that the Marines were going up both sides of this ravine, and they're taking fire from both sides. Under fire, he goes forward and takes out the cave, but in doing so, he's wounded. They try to evacuate him, and he says, hell no, except he used some stronger language. He says to the first sergeant, I'm not going, I'm staying with my boys. So the first sergeant says, it's fine with me, but you'd better clear it with the skipper. So he went to the captain, and again he said, I am not leaving my boys. And the captain said, you okay? He said, good to go. He said, fine, carry on. He wasn't very impressed with his Navy Cross. He was more impressed by the fact that his men, when the commanding general picked one person from each unit to pull out, He was voted by his men to be the one from his unit. And he said, I told my boys before we left, I'd bring them all back. And I brought them all back. So for Sergeant Vaggiani, that was his reward. He is the first and to date only Marine to be awarded a Navy Cross in Afghanistan. It's this. The gentleman you see before you are Captain Corporal Jeremiah Workman. He's the one on the left. The man on the right is Sergeant Jeremy Kraft. In a coordinate knock operation in Fallujah around 2004, they are walking along when all of a sudden they hear gunfire coming from one of the houses. And before they can get up to the house, they say Marines fleeing from the house. But they find out that there are 3 Marines still trapped inside. So he leads assault into this house. Now, this was a house that the insurgents were prepared. They had fortified positions. They were trying to trap Marines. In fact, they wanted to kill Marines. So he leads the first assault in, and they extract one of the Marines. And then they have to withdraw because of the fire. He goes in a second time, again under fire, pulls out another Marine, but this time he's wounded by a grenade, which kills 2 other Marines. And they withdraw once again. Undeterred, he goes in for a third assault and manages to get the last Marine out. They call in tanks and finally an airstrike before they can neutralize that position. The action results in 3 killed and 11 wounded, but they find the remains of 47 insurgents in the rubble. When they award him the Navy Cross and they tell him what heroic things he did, he said, I did what any other Marine would do. That's a picture of Jeremy receiving his Navy Cross. And at present, this is a picture of him. They put him to work at the U.S. Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, Virginia, which is where this picture was taken. And at present, he is the driver for the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. Some of you may be familiar with this picture. This picture, I predict, will become as, my wife says not as famous, but closer to the picture of the flag raising at Iwo Jima. It's certainly bound to become an icon in Marine Corps history. It's Fallujah. It's November of 2004. There is, again, a cordon and knock type of operation, and he is on an overwatch when, again, the insurgents set up a trap in the house for the Marines. They call it the House of Hell. And he joined a squad. They went in there. He said, I wasn't going to leave Marines behind in the hands of insurgents. Now, to understand that, you have to put that into context. Fallujah was the site of, do you remember the Blackwater contractors who were taken from their car, their bodies mutilated and desecrated, and hung from a bridge? And he had resolved that that was not going to happen, not on his watch. They charged through fire to enter the house. He was with a man by the name of Corporal Nichols. They went in, he went into the house, and going into an uncleared room, he came face to face with an insurgent whom he killed. But in the process, both himself and Corporal Nichols were wounded. If that wasn't bad enough, they threw in a grenade. It landed within 2 feet of him, and without hesitation, he covered the body of Corporal Nichols with his own, taking over 40 shrapnel wounds in the process. Not done fighting yet, he dragged Corporal Nichols' body to a position of safety, even though he was wounded himself and was wounded 2 more times in the process, for a total of 7 gunshot wounds and 40 shrapnel wounds. He suffered 60% blood loss, but he continued to put suppressive fire on the enemy until all were safely extracted. He refused treatment until all of his Marines had been treated. And as he was carried out, as you can see, since the Marines are busy carrying him out, there's no one providing cover. And if you'll look in his right hand, you'll see he has his pistol ready. He was refused to be put out of the fight. Finally, to take down the house, they had to put in demolition charges and blow it into rubble. They wanted to amputate his leg, as seriously wounded as he was, but he'd said that if they took his leg, he'd have to get out of the Marine Corps. So he gutted it out, and over 20 operations later, he's still on active duty. He's now a sergeant major in charge of recruiting. When he speaks about his medal, he says, "My men are my heroes." There's another picture of him receiving the Navy Cross, and that's a good close-up of Sergeant Major Cassell. This last group I want to talk to you about, as I've been doing my research, as Captain Wise and I have done our research, we've looked for certain themes. And the one theme that I can detect so far is the willingness of these Marines to put themselves in harm's way to rescue each other or to rescue their comrades. And this has to be the mother of all rescues. The time is August 19th, 1967. These four gentlemen here were assigned to VMO 6. Their helicopter was called Death on Skids. And let me see if I get this right. The gentleman to the left is Lance Corporal. Oh, I wrote this down too, but of course I lost it. That's Lance Corporal Gordon, Gunnery Sergeant Polson, Captain Fairfield, and Captain Plus. They were in a gunship covering medical evacuations when they received a transmission on the emergency channel. The pilot was rather agitated. He says, "We're being shot at. I've left men on the ground. Please, somebody help us." They were about 15 minutes away, and he looked at his crew, kind of like saying, "Do we go?" They all gave him the thumbs up. They said, "We go." So they went. They arrived in the area, and as they're hovering overhead, they can see the Vietnamese bayoneting these men on the ground. This helicopter had been carrying a USO troop when they had taken fire. They had landed to check out the damage. What they didn't know was they'd landed right next to a Viet Cong village, and the Viet Cong attacked. Well, the crew chief and 3 men had disembarked the helicopter to provide security while they checked out the helicopter. Well, when the Vietnamese attacked, with civilians on board, the pilot made a difficult decision. He lifted off, leaving those 4 men on the ground. In fact, the crew chief, whose helmet was still attached to the helicopter, when it lifted off, it broke the crew chief's neck. So he was up, and here comes Death on Skids, which was the name of the helicopter. As they arrived in the area, they see this happening, and first they make several strafing runs, firing every bit of munitions they have to drive the Viet Cong into the jungle. Then they land, placing their helicopter between the Viet Cong and the wounded American soldiers. And while the, while Gordon, the crew chief, stays on the machine, laying down fire against the Viet Cong, Fairfield and Polson disembark the helicopter to retrieve the wounded Marines. They get the first wounded, actually he wasn't a Marine, he was a soldier. They get the first soldier aboard, a man by the name of Staff Sergeant Allen, and they put him on the machine gun, and Gordon joins the other 2, and they get the other 2 Marines on board. The crew chief was already dead. The situation was such that they didn't feel that they could save him. Remember, they're under fire the whole time. So they take off with the 3 wounded. This overloads the weight capacity of the helicopter, and since there was only one way they could take off, which was over the ocean, they do. And they're furiously dumping everything they can overboard to try to lighten the helicopter. The helicopter hits the water 4 times, and if there's any pilots out there, you know how difficult a feat that would be. Nonetheless, they maintain control of the helicopter, and they make it safely to the hospital. Only one of the men, Sergeant Allen, survives. Captain Fairfield later said, "We saw 4 prisoners beating and bayoneting them, and we had no choice. We went in." What probably strikes me is the willingness of these men to expose themselves to almost certain death. Captain Pless was awarded the Medal of Honor, and the other 3 crewmen won the Navy Cross, making them the most decorated air crew in Marine Corps history. As Captain Fairfield later said, there was no plan, there were no leaders. And he said that the bravest man he knew was Gunnery Sergeant Polson, because he never fired a shot. His focus was on retrieving the wounded soldiers. So, then what is valor? And how do we recognize it? Since 1919, the Navy Cross has been awarded 6,921 times. 221 men have won it twice. 53 men have won it 3 times. 7 men have won 4 awards. And 2 men have been awarded the Navy Cross 5 times. But I leave you with this to consider. In World War I, a conflict that lasted 19 months, there were 1,838 Navy Crosses awarded. In World War II, which lasted 44 months, there were 3,972 Navy Crosses awarded. In Korea, which lasted 36 months, there were 268 Navy Crosses awarded. In Vietnam, which lasted 108 months, there were 489 Navy Crosses awarded. In Iraq and Afghanistan, which has lasted to date 56 months, there have been 22 Navy Crosses awarded. So you have to ask yourself, are our servicemen and servicewomen less heroic than in past ages? Well, I think both Captain Wise and myself can tell you this is not the case. They are every bit as heroic, every bit as courageous as any generation that has ever worn the uniform of the United States. So do we value heroism? Do we value valor less today than we do yesterday? I'll let you draw your own conclusions on that. I think the numbers speak for themselves. I'll finish with my co-author's definition of a hero. Captain Wise defines a hero as someone who puts his life on the line for others. By this standard, every single man and woman who wears the uniform of the United States military is a hero.
Thank you, Scott. I think with all of the research and the stories that we've written and read about, it's the bonding of the men. You can start off as patriotism, turf war, but in the end, it's the guy next to you that heroism is born. Save your brother. And that's what the books, Band of Brothers, etc., that's what they all say. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about, I want to tell a few stories about Afghanistan. This is one of Polson's, this is another story. Early in the Afghanistan war, when we were kicking the Taliban out of Afghanistan, you had special forces and you had the Northern Alliance, which were tribes that wanted the Taliban out of their country. the provincial capitals up north, Marzal-Sharif and Quelihar, and I can't get away from the podium because of the television, but they're up right on the border towards Pakistan. And they quickly fell. And 10 miles west of Marzal-Sharif, there was an old fortress, and it had been used by the Soviets, it had been used by the Royal Afghanistan Army, it had been used by the Taliban, and now the Northern Alliance were using it. And as they were gathering up captured Taliban fighters, they were trucking them over to this fortress and putting them down in underground cells. And what happened was that the Northern Alliance general didn't search the men. He thought that perhaps he would engender some type of fighting, and he wanted to show that they could go back and join their tribes, etc., this type of thing. So many of them ended up down there in the underground cells with hand grenades. Well, 2 CIA people that were stationed at Marzal-Sharif walked over to the fort the next morning, and they're going to try and sort out the foreign fighters from the Taliban, which was a very difficult mission. When they got into the courtyard of the fortress, they thought they were going to be talking one man at a time, and they faced 200 of these people. Well, they became very belligerent, the prisoners, and they killed, and our 2 guys killed about 7 of them, and then they overwhelmed another one. And the other guy, Jimmy Spann, was a CIA, and he was the first American killed in the Afghanistan war. The other guy made it out with the German camera crew, and he kind of disappeared over the wall. Well, then there was a big revolt at this fortress, and there were 700 Taliban that broke out of prison, broke into the armory, and were ready to do battle. It took us about a day to bring in gunships and tanks, and finally, out of the 700, there were 51 left, and they captured them. And one of them happened to be this guy, which you probably, the American Taliban, John Walker Lynn, who's now serving in Florence, Colorado at our maximum security prison on a 20-year prison sentence. This is Mike Murphy, and you've probably seen a lot of pictures of him. Mike was one of the 4 SEALs that went into the Hindu Kurdish mountains to look for a Al-Qaeda leader named Sharmak. And he had 3 other men with him. They left Islamabad on the border line of Pakistan and went up into the mountains. Now, the mountains over there, as Scott has talked about, are ruthless, and you can see their area, which is, it was called Operation Red Wing, and that box there was the area that they were responsible for, and that's where they thought this leader was going to be. So the 4 of them walked into the jungle, and that was the kind of mountains that these guys had to face. In other words, they couldn't go over the top, so they were going along the sides, but it was like pure granite. They had nothing to grab onto, and so they made it around, and they made it in about 7 miles, heading for a village. And all of a sudden, they were surrounded by goats, and here was 4 goat herders. And they decided, well, do we kill these guys or do we let them go? And they actually went through the thinking process, well, if we kill these people, then the newspapers are going to get a hold of it, and the SEALs have killed 4 unarmed goat herders. And so they make the decision to let them go. Well, they compromise the mission. The goat herders go to the Taliban and tell them that the 4 SEALs are out there. And these guys are pretty tough. My son went through ranger training with 2 SEALs, and he said they were unbelievable. He said they're just fantastic fighters. The SEALs believe that odds the right odds were 35 to 1. They could handle that. But a little more might be a problem. And of course, they were loaded with ammunition and grenades. They had special weapons and night goggles. But of course, the Taliban had night goggles too, because we had furnished them when they were fighting the Soviets. And all over the northern border in Afghanistan, there were wrecked Russian tanks. The wreckage from the Russians were all over the place. Well, anyway, they let them go. They're going along the side of the mountain, and the next thing you know, a couple of hundred Taliban come over the mountain, and they start forcing them down the mountain. And when they fire an RPG or a rocket, it hits granite and it ricochets all of these stones and everything, and they have to go further down. Sometimes they actually they fall a long distance down the mountain, and they get down into a crevice. And so they're overwhelmed and they're outflanked. Well, the villagers see all this happening down below. And the first, Murphy, in order to get a rescue squad in, he exposes himself and calls back to Islamabad for a rescue helicopter. At that point, he's mortally wounded, but he still fights. Matt Axtell, he's severely wounded. And Danny Dietz, now this is Secretary of the Navy English, presenting the Navy Cross posthumously to Danny Dietz's wife. They're all killed. And Luttrell is the only one that survives. Now, when we wrote the book, all we could do was get a citation, but we couldn't find out the name or what the circumstances were. The SEALs are very reluctant to give any pictures out of any of their men. I mean, especially if they're still on active duty, and that's for obvious reasons. But Luttrell makes it around the mountain, and the Taliban are chasing him. In the fall, he breaks 3 vertebrae. He breaks his wrist, he breaks his nose, and he's shot in the legs twice. And he's still going. And he has no water, and he keeps on going down the mountain. And finally, he runs across some tribesmen. And he figures, well, he's dead. And they say, no Taliban, no Taliban. So they come down and they talk to him as best they can. And he was the medic of the 4 SEALs. So he says that he's a doctor. Well, they kind of go into a huddle and talk about it. And there's a cultural thing over in Afghanistan. If villagers invite somebody into their village, they will defend that person to the last man in the village. I mean, they'll fight the Taliban, anybody, but when he's a guest there, they protect him. They take him down. The villager's elder comes in, tells them just to rest, but they're going to have to move him if Taliban start coming after him. Kids all love him. They're trying to talk to him and chatter and all that kind of stuff. He's moved from cave to house, back and forth. Finally, he has a device that sends a beam up into the air. He puts it on the windowsill, and one of our planes picks it up. And they figure, well, certainly the Taliban wouldn't know what that thing meant or what it was, so we must have one of our guys down there. Well, in the last row where they have to move him out again, he's at the site of an opium field, and it's just at dusk. And he looks across the field, and there's this Sharmak, the guy that they were supposed to get, and he's surrounded by Taliban fighters with weapons. So the elder's son, Ghalib, he goes up and he talks to this guy. And when he comes back, he says, if we don't hand you over, he's going to kill our whole family. And at that moment, what Luttrell doesn't know, that in the forest all around him are all the village men with AK-47s, ready to defend him to the last man. Shortly thereafter, he's surrounded by rangers and Green Berets. They've been looking for him for 5 days. They take him out. He gets into the helicopter, goes back to Islamabad, and eventually he goes into recovery. But he demands to go back to Islamabad and stay with his unit until they're ready to come home. And that's what happens. He goes and he comes back with them. And the heroics of this, of all of these men, of these 4 SEALs, is just an unbelievable story. And it's called Lone Survivor, the book. This is the book that he wrote. And if you ever get a chance to read that book, and you want to read about the bravery and the valor of our fighting people, get that book. That's a fantastic book. Now, I'm going to tell a story about Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy is often called the forgotten Kennedy. And I think most people here, does anybody here know what happened to Joe Kennedy? Maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or something like that. Well, he and Jack were always competitive. They were always, whether it's flag football out in the field or whatever it was, Joe wanted to be the first Catholic president. So he ends up going into naval aviation training. It takes 18 months to go through that. In the meantime, Jack graduates, ends up in the Pacific, and becomes this hero of the PT boat incident. Well, Joe wants to even the odds. So he gets ordered over to England, and he starts flying anti-submarine warfare missions over the Bay of Biscay, which is where all the U-boats came out of France, out of Pens, as they were headed towards the Atlantic to sink Atlantic merchant ships. He finishes 32 missions, but he still hasn't sunk a U-boat, hasn't done anything to earn a medal. So he volunteers to stay. Now what they do is they send him up to another British airfield, and they've got a new operation called Aphrodite. And the idea of it is since the V-1 rockets were now being fired to England, is to somehow take out those rocket launchers. And the bombers have been trying to do it, and the launchers were pushed back in the mountains, and they couldn't do it. So they get the idea, they take B-17s and B-24s, and they load them with dynamite. And they put a pilot and co-pilot in there, and they have 2 motherships. And they will fly to a certain point over England. The pilot and co-pilot bail out over a British airfield, and the mothership turns the aircraft around and heads towards a target on the French coast. Joe and his pilot go up, and they just turn south, and they're about to turn to go across the channel, about to bail out, and the plane blows up. And there's absolutely nothing left of the plane. And so Joe's killed, and this is a picture of his mother and father receiving the Navy Cross. And they named a ship after him, the Joseph Kennedy destroyer. And his brother Bobby comes out of school and serves for a period of time in the gunnery department on board the ship. And the ship is now on display up in the Cape area. And I'm going to tell you, we'll end this on a little lighter note now. I wrote 4 of these books on stars that served in the military. It's amazing what some of them did. I got to know Paul Newman fairly well. And my wife didn't know exactly what I was writing at the time because I was pumping these things out. And I met him out in California, and he was making a movie up in the hills. And he wanted some kind of plans, because he wanted to have a hand carver up in Connecticut cut a model of a TBM. He was in TBMs. He was the radio man in the center of the aircraft, and that's the same aircraft that former President Bush flew and was shot down. So he ended up on the Hollandia, which was a small carrier in the Southern Pacific, and they carried replacement aircraft. When a big deck would lose a plane, one of them would fly up from Hollandia. So when I was in the National Archives, I happened to see this picture, and it's the ready room of the Hollandia. Now, the Hollandia, being a small deck, only has 1 ready room. So when I got out to California, I just missed him. He had gone up to the mountains, but I knew his secretary, and I said, here's the plans, and here's some other stuff. And oh, by the way, I found this picture. And Paul's probably going to know a bunch of these people in here because we're only one radio room. Well, not only did he know somebody, but, and he's in it. And you can see way in the back, that head sticking up, the dark head. And you see what I'm talking about? That's him. And he said, where in the world did you ever get that picture? And I said, in the archives. He said, I never saw it before. So he calls me at the hotel. And of course, I'm on a plane coming back, so he calls my wife. And he says, is Captain Wise there? And she says, no. And he says, well, this is Paul Newman. And she said, who? And he said, Paul Newman. And he proceeded to talk to her for about 15 minutes. The nicest guy in the world. And of course, my wife called everybody that she ever knew in her lifetime. Now, this is Wayne Morris. He was the only Navy ace. And he was a B-grade movie star. In the first movie that he made when he got out of the Navy, he was in a movie called Fighter Pilot. And he was in McCampbell's air group. And McCampbell shot down 34 Japanese planes. He was our biggest ace. Unfortunately, what happened is that after the war, McCampbell had command of an aircraft carrier called Bernard Richard, brought it around the West Coast and invited all of his old pilots to come aboard for a cruise. He went aboard, was eating breakfast one morning, ran up 5 decks, got up to the bridge, dropped dead. He was 42. But his wife was marvelous. She wrote me and sent me all kinds of stuff. He's buried at Arlington, by the way. He won 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses. This is Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby was a physical therapist at Bethesda, a tremendous athlete. And as a result of his basketball and his everything, in fact, he tried out for the Baltimore Orioles. He was given a scholarship to Temple. And just an incredible guy. It said Henry Fonda winning his bronze medal. He was aboard the Curtis, and was an air intelligence officer. That's Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Is a PT boat commander down in off Sicily. That's Eddie Albert, and Eddie Albert was at Tarawa, and you know the terrible beating that we took there. And he was in one of these small Higgins boats, and I got this out of the Life magazine. And if you look at the third guy from the left with the white cap on, that's Albert, and that was his small boat. That what he would do is go in with the landing craft, and as the landing craft got stuck on a reef because the water was too low, he would pull these Marines out and take them over to 2 destroyers and deposit them there. Well, the Marines put him in for a Silver Star. He happened to have a skipper who was anti-Semitic, and Eddie's real name was Heimberger, and his paperwork got lost. So Eddie just came back to Hollywood, picked up his career as best he could, and it wasn't until about 10 years ago that veterans from those destroyers put the pressure on the government of Pennsylvania to get him his Bronze Star, which he did get. But he lived to be 91, and I got to know him fairly well. Ernest Borgnine, greatest guy in the world, just wonderful. He's full of pep and energy. You wouldn't know he's any different than he was 10 years ago. Tony Curtis, he was on a submarine depot ship, never made any patrols. But one time I was down at the Navy Memorial, and he was there with one of his new wives, and he had on a Dolphins. And you only wear gold Dolphins if you were qualified as an officer on a destroyer, which took so many patrols. So some older guy walked up to him and said, "What boat were you on?" And he said, "Well, I was on the Thetis." He said, "That wasn't a boat, that was a depot ship. That's where we all came back, got our boats cleaned up, and then we went back out to sea." And he said, "Take that off." So there's Tony Curtis taking off these Dolphins. As soon as the guy walked out, Tony puts them back on, wore them for the rest of his life. And Jack Lemmon, graduate of Harvard, didn't see any action except he was put down in decommissioning detail of the Light Champlain. There's a very funny story about that, but I won't go into that. It takes too long. And here's the two of them out of uniform, but I mean, you know, what the heck. Now, this man's name is John Howard. His real name is Cox. He's the only movie star that won the Navy Cross during World War II. And he was on a minesweeper which hit a mine, blew in half, and he was the XO and he helped save a lot of the sailors. And if you don't recognize the name, if you happen to see the old movie Lost Horizon, he was Ronald Colman's brother in the movie who took the woman through the pass and she turned old. And you see he's between Coleman on the left and Robert and Mitchum on the right. He was in The High and the Mighty and a few other films. Humphrey Bogart. He went through Great Lakes. He ended up as a coxswain aboard a troop ship bringing our troops back from Europe. He had this, as you know, distinctive paralyzed upper lip. When he went into the Navy, he didn't have it. When he came out, he had it. There's all kinds of stories about how that happened, but he was kind of a raucous type guy, so it could have been in a fight, it could have been almost anything. He spent a lot of time in the brig, by the way. And the guy on the left is Boone. Have gun, will travel. Some of you might remember that. He was a ball turret gunner on that TVM, the torpedo bomber that I showed you. And every time he took off, he wore a coonskin hat. And then the skipper of the ship went crazy over that, but that's what he did. And that's Cesar Romero with Betty Grable. He was a Coast Guard enlisted man. He ended up as a chief petty officer, and he was stationed aboard a Coast Guard ship off Greenland. And their job was to stop the Germans from establishing any radio communication stations up on Greenland. But one thing this guy did is that when he got out, he took, and until he died, and his brother told me this story, Ricardo, that once a year he would take the entire crew of the Cavalier, which was the ship he was attached to Las Vegas for a week and pay all expenses. And he did this for something like 15 years. That's Tyrone Power on the right. Tyrone Power was a Marine Corps transport pilot and was flying wounded out of Okinawa, and then after the Japanese surrendered, he was flying supplies in and out. And the guy on the left is Leif Erikson, and he was a movie star, but I don't recall exactly what he was in. Bob Stack was a champion skeet shooter. He wanted to be a Navy pilot. He had a dominant right eye. Couldn't qualify as a Navy pilot, so he was a gunnery instructor, and he was teaching gunners aboard bombers and the anti-aircraft gunners aboard carriers. And one of the anti-aircraft gunners was a Marine named Jonathan Winters. Lee Marvin. Now, Lee Marvin was the first guy to, when he got actors, he put them through boot training. And the Dirty Dozen, when he got all those actors together and he looked at them and he said, "You guys aren't going to make it," and he went to the director and he said, "I want these guys for 10 days. He went out and he bought them all Garand rifles, taught them all how to break them down, how to take care of them. He gave them boot training in 10 days, and every movie he was in perfect uniform, always perfect uniform. And he used to sit in airports and see a Marine come in, and boy, his chest would go out, and he'd say, "The medal of the man," he was just nutty about the Marine Corps. He's buried in Arlington Cemetery and buried right next to the boxer Joe Louis. And he just has this plain white stone. Just Lee Marvin, he was wounded on Saipan in the spine, almost was paralyzed. And he tells his wife, Pam, told me the story that when he was recovering in Guadalcanal, that there were so many Purple Hearts that they just walked down the aisle and they'd call out names and they'd just throw boxes of Purple Hearts to people. There was no ceremonies or anything like that. Sterling Hayden. I talked to his widow. He was married to Madeline Carroll, and he went through Marine Corps training and was commissioned. but he hated Hollywood, he hated the discipline of the Marine Corps, and he got himself into OSS. He ended up in Bari, Italy. He was a master seaman from Boothbay Harbor at a very early age, so he really knew boating. And he was given charge of 50 barges, and he was taking supplies over to the Yugoslav partisans and supplying them. And also he was bringing out downed aviators out of the woods. And what he used to mention is that they'd put their boxes down on the pier, and people would run down there and paint over USA, and they'd put on USSR. So he didn't know who he was waiting for. And Kirk Douglas is the first officer starting from the left in the front row. He was on a small craft in the Pacific. They thought they had a radar contact, submarine contact. They backed up. The skipper said, put a dive marker down. They dropped a depth charge. They lifted the back of the boat, practically broke his back. He went back and he was medically discharged. That's Buddy Epson. He was the XO on a weather ship off the Aleutians. And Bob Taylor, when I went through flight training, if I ever saw another photo or another picture that he made about how to fly, we just about, it was, he made them all. We saw all these. It was Robert Taylor 101. And Martha Ray. Martha Ray had entertained troops World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. In Vietnam, she became completely obsessed with the Green Berets. And she would come back, do a show, get enough money, go back, entertain the Berets up in the mountains, up in wherever they were at. And she'd act as a nurse. She'd bandage them up, and they didn't know what she was. Well, and when she got older and she passed away, she's the only civilian that was buried at the Green Beret Cemetery in Fort Bragg. The only civilian. And I think here she's probably walking around looking for Jane Fonda. I'm not sure. And that's our show. Oops. I should have gone back. Oh, well, we'll turn it off.